You're standing inside a timber house while the Arctic wind howls outside, pressing against the walls like a living thing, searching for cracks, weaknesses, warmth to steal. You can feel the cold trying to crawl in through the wood, through the seams, through your breath. And here's the question you can't ignore. How did Viking families survive winters like this without modern insulation, without heaters, without plastic or foam, while some of their homes lasted centuries? You're not looking at brute strength or thicker walls. You're looking at a quiet trick, almost invisible, built into the walls themselves. Imagine living in a world where fuel is precious, storms can last for weeks, and a single draft could mean sickness or death. Every decision you make as a builder suddenly matters. This is where the mystery begins, because the Vikings weren't just warriors or sailors, they were careful observers of wind, moisture and heat. They learned that stopping the cold wasn't about fighting it head-on, but confusing it, slowing it, exhausting it before it ever reached your skin. This wall trick didn't look impressive from the outside. It didn't rely on rare materials. But once you understand how it worked, you start to realize something unsettling. We forgot it not because it failed, but because we stopped needing to think this carefully about survival. Now imagine you're living through a Viking winter, where daylight barely exists and the wind never seems to rest. You don't have central heating, and every piece of firewood you burn today is something you won't have tomorrow. Inside your home, warmth is life, and drafts are enemies. You feel them first at night when the fire fades and the walls start whispering with cold. For Arctic families, the stakes weren't comfort, they were survival. Frostbite, illness and starvation followed heat loss closely. You couldn't just build thicker walls, because thick, solid wood cracked, warped, and wicked moisture inside. Stone walls stole heat faster than they held it. This is where experience taught brutal lessons. Vikings noticed that wind didn't need big holes. It hunted tiny gaps, then expanded them with ice and pressure. Over generations, builders learned to treat walls as systems, not barriers. They thought about how air moves, how moisture behaves, how cold sneaks in layers. And because families built these homes themselves, knowledge passed quietly, not in books, but in hands and habits. You weren't copying designs, you were copying survival. This wall trick emerged because failure was immediate and unforgiving. If it didn't work, you didn't just rebuild. You froze. Here's where you step inside the wall itself, because the trick wasn't a single material, but a layered strategy. Imagine building 2 timber walls instead of 1, not pressed tightly together, but separated by a narrow, irregular cavity. That space wasn't empty. It was filled with loosely packed organic material like moss, straw, turf fibres, or animal hair. Here's the clever part. Nothing was uniform. The gaps were uneven on purpose. When wind tried to force its way through the outer wall, it lost speed inside that chaotic layer. Air pockets trapped heat, while fibres caught moisture before it could condense deeper inside. Then there's the way the wood was arranged. Planks overlapped vertically and horizontally, creating natural baffles that redirected airflow. Imagine wind entering and being forced to turn, slow down, and split again and again. By the time it reached the inner wall, it had almost no energy left. This is where it changes everything. Instead of sealing the house airtight, Vikings allowed the walls to breathe. Moisture could escape outward without dragging heat with it. You weren't fighting nature. You were negotiating with it, letting it pass on your terms. This worked because it respected how heat and wind actually behave, not how people wished they behaved. Cold doesn't invade like water. It sneaks in as moving air and moisture. By breaking that movement into layers, Viking walls exhausted the cold before it reached living space. The irregular packing mattered more than density. Smooth, tight insulation creates channels when it settles, but uneven organic fillers collapse into themselves, constantly reshaping barriers. The wood itself played a role too. Timber expands and contracts with humidity, sealing gaps in winter when moisture freezes, tightening joints naturally. Here's the unexpected logic. Small, controlled leaks were safer than sealed walls. Tiny airflow prevented rot by drying the structure from within. That meant homes lasted decades, sometimes centuries, without collapsing from hidden decay. The wall wasn't static. It responded to seasons. In winter, it tightened and insulated. In summer, it released moisture and heat. You start to see why iron fasteners and rigid construction later caused problems. Metal didn't move with the wood. Solid barriers trapped moisture. Viking builders trusted flexibility over strength. They didn't overpower the environment, they outlasted it by letting their homes breathe, bend, and adapt quietly year after year. So why did this disappear? You might expect a dramatic failure, but it wasn't that. It was convenience. As industrial materials arrived, faster building mattered more than understanding climate. Nails replaced joinery. Brick and concrete replaced timber systems. Fossil fuels made heat cheap, so efficiency became optional. You didn't need walls that thought for you when you could just burn more fuel. Over time, the knowledge faded because it wasn't written down. It lived in hands and local tradition. Wars, urbanization, and standardized housing erased regional tricks. Ironically, modern sealed walls created new problems Vikings had already solved. Moisture trapped inside led to mold, rot, and energy loss. We replaced adaptive systems with rigid ones, and then spent decades fixing the consequences with machines. The Viking wall trick wasn't outlawed or proven wrong. It was simply forgotten, buried under the idea that progress meant harder, tighter, stronger. You stopped building homes for environments and started building environments inside homes. The wall became a divider instead of a partner. And once that shift happened, the quiet intelligence of layered timber walls seemed unnecessary, even primitive, despite working perfectly for centuries. Now you're living in a time where energy costs rise, climates grow harsher, and sustainability suddenly matters again. You are hearing architects talk about breathable walls, passive insulation, and natural materials like it's something new. But when you look closely, you realize it's old knowledge resurfacing. Viking wall design shows you that efficiency doesn't require technology, just understanding. You see echoes of it in modern double-stud walls, natural fibre insulation, and passive house airflow principles. The lesson isn't to copy Viking homes exactly. It's to think the way they did. Ask how air moves, how moisture behaves, and how materials change over time. When you design with those questions, you need fewer machines to fix mistakes later. There's something grounding about that. It reminds you that survival once depended on attention, not excess. As you think about your own home, your energy use, your environment, you start noticing where we still fight nature instead of working with it. Maybe that's why this wall trick matters now. Not because it's ancient, but because it teaches you to listen again.